Given this opportunity. I would like to ask, you mentioned in your speech that India is probably one of the most important centers where we're seeing these concurrent phenomenon of globalization on one hand and regionalism on the other hand. What, in your opinion, I mean, to what extent can we rely on our own democratic governance mechanisms within India, and to what extent can we rely on the global governance paradigms that are emerging? Thank you.
Which reminds me, I failed to answer a similar question when I was answering those 6 on religious intolerance. I'll come back to that.
First, I'd like to congratulate you, Dr. Tharoor, for this very prestigious award. This is slide 2. I have to discussion concerning the Indian roles in the global economic reform. Also, I have been looking to India as a champion of developing country when you negotiate the WTO agreement. Also, international financial reform, India also one of the active member of G20. Of course, we have been sharing a lot of ideas and initiatives how we are to move forward with this some kind of international reform of financial architecture. So this is, I'd like to ask you.
Thank you, Rajan. That too reminds me of a question I didn't answer earlier about whether we shouldn't fight for the trade union of developing countries. I'll come back to that.
My name is Klaus Voll. European diplomats observe that India is perhaps too much focusing on the P5 and neighbor Pakistan, and that MEA is still divided into Europe West and Europe East, and that India is perhaps not fully, for instance, understanding Germany's political role within the EU. Might be this becomes now better after Lisbon. Would you share such opinions, and how would you convince them? And short second one, through which instruments should India better prepare for global governance, through more expanding of its own foreign service, or through other modern instruments in reaching out into other parts of this world?
Let's take a last question and we'll have you back on it.
Very good evening, sir. My name is Rajan. I'm an ex-student of this campus, graduated about 10 years back. Sir, while we all struggle to, while India struggles so hard to bring itself into inclusion on the global front, my question is very fundamental. Why don't we bring about so much strength in ourselves that the world tries to include us? To protect the body from disease, we do not exterminate the germs, we strengthen immunity. Why don't we ourselves, with JKLF, Ulfa, Naxals, Maoists, when will we become a power to reckon with, so that the globe looks at us and not we trying to look at them?
Great questions, all of them, and so were the first 6. Let me see if I can remember them all this time and not leave any unanswered. On the question of religious extremism and divisions within our own society and globally, of course there is a fundamental domestic responsibility to deal with these issues, and that's something which very clearly our government has taken on as part of its ruling ethos, is indeed to promote what we call secularism. I personally prefer the word pluralism, but the idea of sustaining a plural society where people are not defined or limited in terms of their opportunities by the faith they profess. At the global level, we have been a voice for increased understanding and dialogue amongst various religious traditions. The UN has had a dialogue of civilizations, initially proposed by Iran, and followed by an alliance of civilizations led by Turkey and Spain. And these are all very good initiatives to bring together people of different backgrounds, and India remains a strong supporter of these and the way in which these are moving forward. Whether the two reinforce each other, perhaps, is part of your question. And I would argue that clearly they do, because ultimately, at the global level, you can establish norms, you can articulate ideas, you can put forward if you like, a certain universal understanding. Each of this has to be applied and implemented locally, nationally. And so if others don't do in their countries what we are trying to do in ours, then clearly the global level understanding alone will not suffice to prevent these problems getting out of hand. The second question, of course, Ambassador, also ties into an earlier one that was asked as to whether India, instead of seeking to get into the Security Council, permanent membership shouldn't instead be content with leading the developing world. The answer is, of course, we have led the developing world. I mean, we have been a founding member of the Non-Aligned Movement, a founding member of the G77 group of developing countries. As Ambassador rightly pointed out, there's been a lot of work already done in terms of trying to reform international economic practices and financial institutions. We have led the global fight for decolonization as head of the UN Decolonization Committee. We have fought against apartheid in South Africa from a year before we were independent. We first raised it in 1946. So there is a long history, if you like, of India being a very strong member of the trade union of developing countries, formerly oppressed peoples. But I don't think that being a trade unionist should disqualify you from joining the management, especially if you have reached a point of your own experience and your own ability to contribute. Where, to go back to that last question, where the managers themselves feel that you belong amongst them, I think we can make a contribution. I say this with a lot of humility, because I don't think that in advancing the argument that we can contribute.
But I'm sure that for some of you at least it has raised more questions than it would answer. Shashi Tharoor has very kindly agreed to answer a few questions. Maybe what you could do is invite a few questions together and then you decide what to do. So the floor is open. Anyone? Yeah, there's a mic there. Okay. Tell me who you are.
Good evening, sir. I'm Rahul Mishra. I'm faculty member here. And thanks for your enlightening lecture. I have a question that there is as you have recounted several successes of United Nations, but there are big failures like Iraq War, NATO action in Afghanistan, failure in climate change talks. UN has become a very weaker institution in that way, with the clash of interests between developing countries and developed countries. My question is, where does India fit in? Do our interests lie in joining the high table of United Nations Security Council as a major emerging power, or we should fight for the developing countries, poor countries, countries where the voices are not unheard, and then continue with the legacy of our freedom struggle? Thank you.
My name is Bhattacharyya. I think the UN Security Council reform is basically about inclusion. It cannot be about exclusion. And you did mention that now, past about 2 decades, we are seeing a new United Nations. Now, this new United Nations is basically a function of the type of changes that has come about at the international level. And because there is not much of paralysis of the council and so on. So, therefore, whether it would actually be a very well justified move to have many more, blockages for the new Security Council that you talked about. And since United Nations, only when the nations are united, you have United Nations. And what we are talking perhaps is about, not about global interdependence, we are talking about international interdependence. Because when we talk in terms of the global interdependence, that means that the global commons, you refer to many of the problems, I might like to call them as global commons. Now, these global commons can be addressed in terms of international cooperation. And United Nations is actually a political organization. And if it is a political organization, so progress can be only to the extent that the nations are willing to cooperate, and to the extent that they are willing to cooperate. So I was thinking that if you, if you could also say a little about international interdependence instead of global interdependence, because suppose India goes for and underlines global interdependence, when we find that what is left is that not even international interdependence has been ensured, then perhaps we will not be able to play the role that we perhaps could. And the last point was that you talked about responsible sovereignty. I was thinking that perhaps if we can, since the focus is still on the passport, and since the borders and the boundaries are still much more important than international cooperation, whether they should be or not is a different issue. So if the focus could be on sovereignty as responsibility instead of a responsible sovereignty.
I'm Kant Bhargava, former Secretary General SARC and now living in Canada. First of all, very kind of you to have quoted our Prime Minister, his point about responsible sovereignty. And taking the cue from the previous speaker, my question would be that how do you view the problems of bridging the religious divide on one hand and of having human responsibility also as an important thing as human rights. So these are my two questions.
I'm Sunil Jakat. First, I would like to compliment you on your brilliant speech. My question is, how would India's desire to be on the security would help India? Don't you think it's more of a desire to be recognized on the international forum than very substantial contribution that a seat can make to Indian security vis-a-vis Pakistan or China?
I don't know whether the questions will be too many. Okay. I was just wondering whether UN is still UN or US one. Now, I entirely share the significance of establishing these international bodies and the great vision of FDR, Stalin and Churchill. I don't think that Truman was worthy successor as a president of US, but still he had that concern. Now, how do we account for the kind of search that went on in Iraq in the name of finding weapons of mass destruction which were not there, instead used weapons of mass destruction in the name of creating democracy there? And the second question is, I have still great respect for Pandit Nehruji because I think he is still living, he has been the greatest democratic Prime Minister of India. And at the same time, we could not stop partition. After 65 years, we cannot reunite, solve the domestic quarrel. And essentially it's a domestic quarrel, as I view it. Now, what kind of Indian perspective we can think of to make UN truly UN and not US?
Rakesh Chaudhary. So how do you see the likelihood of, say, 2 decades down the line, USA, China and India being the 3 dominating players on the world stage? And how would you see the problem or opportunity for global governance under that scenario?
All right. Try to keep them all straight in my head, but of course many of them are linked. The broad theme of the UN, Council reform, dominance of the organization by some, etc. In fact, when you mention the US, you should know that the first name that was discussed by Roosevelt and Churchill for the new organization they were planning to create was the United States, and then they realized that name was already taken. So it ended up the United Nations. And as you said earlier, Professor, there, that the nations have to be united. I used to have two favorite typos in letters I received when I was working in the UN. My absolute favorite was the letter that came addressed to the untied nations. The other one was, of course, that people were inveighing against the atomic bomb and write about not the nuclear policy but the unclear policy. But that also existed. Anyway, coming back to the substance of the issue. I do want to stress that as far as the UN is concerned as an organization, it has its successes and its failures, it has its limitations. In many ways it is a mirror of the world. It basically reflects as a mirror the extent of convergence and disagreement in the world. And where the world is united, it turns out to be effective. Where the world is not, as somebody mentioned the Iraq War, where there is no unity on a position, then things can happen by default. I don't think anyone has suggested that the UN has had a perfect or unblemished record. Certainly I did not suggest that and would not wish to. But as I said, it prevented a lot of worse things from happening. And it was not just, as somebody else argued, a political organization. It also did a great deal in things like development, socio-economic transformation, the setting of the global agenda on issues ranging from population to climate change. It's all taking place at UN mandated forums. So I am personally convinced that the organization is already transitioning into this vision of an organization that can serve a world of problems that cut across frontiers, much beyond the purely political agenda of the Security Council. The Security Council is the body that deals with international peace and security. And it was good that you asked the blunt question, how does it help India? The truth is, we are not seeking a seat in the Council in the spirit of how does it help us. We are seeking a seat in the Council in the spirit of how can we help the world. That we feel ready to play a responsible role on the global stage, and we believe that in the existing patterns of global governance, this is the forum within which such a role can be played. So that is the difference. We are really not in this to gain specific things for ourselves. We are in there to play this role, and yes, there may be an element of seeking recognition for where we have arrived in the world, arguably, but at the same time, it is in a spirit of service. It's very much in that Nehruvian ideal that we can make a contribution and serve. You spoke of India, India, China, and the US. I don't think we're thinking in those terms. Certainly, the US and increasingly China are in a league of their own, and we are a significant economy. We have a number of problems we're still trying to solve. We displace a lot of weight in our region and to some degree in the world. We have a number of strengths and assets. But I don't think that the way you put it as being one of the quote-unquote dominant powers in the world is the way in which India would see it. We see ourselves as a country which has a contribution to make. We see there are others that have comparable contributions to make. They have different sizes, different strengths, but there are other countries with per capita GDPs that are significant. I'm not going to name countries and look at we're picking, the A team. But I guess if people were to sit around picking an A team, we would certainly consider ourselves to be part of that A team, both in terms of global economic strength, political and indeed even military strength, but more important in terms of our willingness and ability to contribute globally to the world as a whole. So that's broadly it. On your specific point about the extent to which the US dominates, I think the recent history of the UN would suggest that's no longer an accurate presumption, because the US, for example, could not get the Security Council to adopt the resolution it wanted to have passed on authorizing it to go to war in Iraq. So somebody else mentioned the Iraq war in the opposite context. There's an example of where you can see that however strong a country may be, there are some limitations. It is true that when a country like the US sits around the Security Council table with 14 other countries, those 14 are certainly conscious of their bilateral relationship with the US and the decisions they take. But I think even the US would not suggest that it always gets its way. Otherwise there wouldn't be so many conservative think tanks that dedicate so much energy to counting up the number of votes that countries are coming up with voting against the US as they see it. So that I think is still too simplistic a view. On the Iraq war discrediting the UN, again I don't buy that argument, because I believe that the United Nations cannot be judged merely by those issues on which countries don't agree. Indeed, Iraq was not the only war that's taken place in the world since 1945. There have been plenty of wars. But what was interesting is even if the UN was essentially unable to prevent that war, the moment the war was over, which as you know took place in 3 weeks' time, it became indispensable to the ensuing peace. Without the UN Security Council resolution, there could have been no legitimization of the occupation. The transition to the various governing structures, the Internal Council, the Governing Council, finally the elected government of Iraq, took place under UN auspices. The UN helped design and run the elections there. And then, of course, we've got the economic development and other activities that went on. We still have a UN mission in Iraq. And I have lost one of my closest friends and colleagues in the bomb blast that took so many UN lives, 22 UN lives in 2003. So my argument would be that to judge the UN on the wrong side of the Iraq continuum is to do it a disservice. In fact, it has definitely proven its indispensability in what happened afterwards.
Good evening, sir. By saying that it's indeed a pleasure to be asking you a question in person. Not that we've been deprived 2 weeks at all, but
Massive way suggesting in any way that we are better or superior or whatever to anybody else. It is simply that by virtue of our size, the nature of the problems we have fought to overcome, the contributions we have made in the world over the years, and so on, we have a useful role we can play. And that ultimately boils down to the kind of contribution we believe we can make. But you're totally right that in addition to the talk about the P5 and the Security Council and so on, there has to be a real focus on the international financial and economic institutions that so much affect the well-being of people of the world. And you know, we have not spoken about regional cooperation. Global governance is not only at the totally universal level, there's tremendous amount of progress taking place at the regional level. And you know, for example, that India's involvement with your own region, ASEAN, and our contributions by joining things like the East Asian Summit and the ASEAN Regional Forum, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization with People as Observer, and all of these things are a reflection of our understanding that there is a lot we can do through joining smaller groups. So my own pet story is the one of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. 18 countries, an organization none of you have ever heard of, but it straddles 3 continents and brings together countries whose only element in common is that they're washed by the waters of the Indian Ocean. But the potential for putting together a small group to do effective work together is so great. And then we have something like BIMSTEC, which brings in, as you know, Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, all together in an element of cooperation which cuts across boundaries, but in a sense creates a region where there was no sense of a region in the political or geopolitical sense before. So there is tremendous potential for that sort of cooperation. India is committed to doing its part. Turning to Mr. Klaus' questions, the notion that we have a lot to learn, we will never contest. There's a lot of improvement, certainly there is room for. But I do want to say that India is much more conscious than ever before of the need for change and expansion. For example, last year, before I joined government, 2 years ago now, 2008, the cabinet approved a proposal to essentially double the size of our foreign service. And the reason it did so is an implicit acknowledgement of the fact that the size and functioning of our service in the context of today's 21st century demands and the widespread reach of the Indian presence is in fact too modest, and we need to do something about that. You mentioned the excessive focus on the neighborhood. Certainly to some degree that is a reality for us. We are not going to be able, I think, to play the kind of global role or indeed even the national role that we would like to play if we are constrained by limitations and failures in our own neighborhoods. We want to contribute to the growth and development of all our neighbors and rise above the immediate problems that distance us from one of them. But having said that, on the larger issue, you're totally right, we are trying to strengthen our institutions, and it's not just doubling the foreign service. We've started doing some very serious thinking and work on increasing the study of international relations, for example, in India, which is very limited at the moment. Is confined largely to a handful of campuses, area studies, and so on. There's no equivalent of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, or the Woodrow Wilson School, or Johns Hopkins in the US, or the HUEI in Geneva, or even the LSE in London, other than the School of International Studies at JNU, and to some degree the Department of International Relations in Jabalpur. There's a lot more that needs to be done, and I personally I'm committed to encouraging this. Every time I meet an educationist, I tell them, think about setting up a a program in international relations, international affairs, and I think it's very important to enhance that. And the same thing applies to our think tanks. We're now creating a culture of think tanks, excessively centered in Delhi, but they're coming up. And if some of them can focus knowledgeably on problems beyond our immediate periphery, that would be very good. And finally, I just want to agree with you, because in my other speeches on domestic themes to our domestic audiences, I always stress that before we can speak in terms of being a great power globally, we absolutely have to solve our own internal problems. And that has been a fundamental issue. This was a specific topic. We had discussed global governance, and so the theme was very much a state-centered theme. But if you look internally, clearly we have to bring along the majority of our people. Indeed, I would even argue, and our Prime Minister has pretty effectively articulated this, that the fundamental purpose of our foreign policy is to help create conditions in India that will enable us to pull our people out of poverty and to focus on the development and well-being of our own people. So if we can do that, we can overcome not only the terror of the jihadists or the Naxalites or the Maoists that you mentioned, but also the daily terror of ill health, of hunger, poverty, suffering, of unemployment, malnutrition. If we can overcome both kinds of terror, we will obviously be in a much, much better place on the world stage. And I just want to endorse the spirit behind your question. But I at the same time want to say that it's not that the countries that, for example, became the P5 in 1945 did so when they were completely free of problems. The US still had significant poverty. They still had the problems of the blacks in America who had not yet received their full democratic rights. They had the difficulties in Appalachia and inner cities and so on. But they were still acknowledged as a world power. So the mere fact that you have problems at home doesn't mean that you should not nonetheless play a significant role around the world. It's just that you have to be conscious of both, and certainly we in the government of India are. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor, for a superb lecture and also for answering all these questions so comprehensively. I think what has come out very clearly from this discussion is that in this postmodern world in which we live, the existing institutional mechanisms that we have are quite clearly anachronistic. But the problem is that you can't have global governance, which is obviously the key to having a credible roadmap in order to solve any of the problems on our agenda today, like climate change or weapons of mass destruction, etc. But unless global governance also accepts and adjusts to the new sort of power shifts in world politics, which, for example, the UN has refused to do, and therefore the UN continues to dilute its own possible relevance to solving international problems, it is not clear as to how a suitable paradigm or an adequate paradigm of global governance can emerge. And you can't have progress on critical global issues if it is held hostage to occasional sector-specific agreements between key countries, which is what is probably happening today, whether it is on trade-related issues, or financial issues, or climate change and so on. So I think the key question which was not sufficiently discussed because of lack of time is